My name is Samuel Cross, and I am 34 years old today. I am currently sitting alone inside the concrete command vault of a classified deep-sea monitoring station. The freezing waters of Prince William Sound, Alaska are hitting the granite cliffs outside my steel window shutters. I am recording this raw audio feed directly into an encrypted military black box storage unit, because exactly 20 minutes ago, the primary surface power grid of our facility lost its current completely. I work as a chief systems engineer for the Naval Intelligence Branch, monitoring the deep water cable arrays. The ocean floor below this cliff is covered in thousands of miles of heavy reinforced fiber optic lines. These cables transmit global tactical data packets between the Pentagon and our northern radar outposts. The public thinks these underwater communication networks are just carrying standard civilian internet traffic. They look at the quiet blue maps of the sea, and they believe the dark abyss is completely silent and dead. But they do not know what our subsurface hydrophone matrix captured tonight at 3:14 a.m. The secondary acoustic sensor array triggered a maximum critical alert, indicating a heavy mass displacement. A high-definition naval sonar system doesn't track metallic hulls or standard propeller rotations of submarines. It measures the literal water density changes and the microscopic pressure shifts of the aquatic medium. The telemetry terminal showed that an unknown anomaly had aligned with our main cable at a depth of 10,000 feet. The digital radar indicators glitched out, completely trying to measure the physical velocity of the shape. The automated software logs indicated the target was moving faster than 50 knots, but without creating a water wake. It didn't use a diesel engine. It didn't create cavitation bubbles. It generated zero friction against the Arctic currents. The black silhouette was moving in a perfect parallel sequence right beside our data line like a biological predator. I adjusted the manual low-frequency audio filters to isolate the acoustic signature of the underwater object. The screen on my primary cathode ray tube monitor was rendered in heavy black and white analog film grain. The ocean floor was dark, the static noise was high, and everything looked completely barren through the cameras. But when I raised the sensitivity of the internal copper diaphragms, my hands began to shake violently against the desk. Through the static roar of the deep-sea current, a human voice began to bleed directly onto my secure headset line. It wasn't a distorted radio transmission from a nearby fishing vessel or a military code from the fleet. It was a clean, soft, clear voice of a man speaking directly into the underwater microphone from the dark abyss. The voice belonged to my father, who had been declared missing at sea exactly 3 years ago during a storm. The speaker said, "Samuel, please do not report this signal deviation to the Naval Base Commander at Anchorage. The core tracking module has successfully matched your voice frequency code from the control room table. The entity is ready to bring the secondary family database unit down to the recording station floor." The digital sonar display on my secondary console terminal emitted a sharp, frantic warning chirp. The black-white heat signature of the subsurface object suddenly detached from the deep seafloor bedrock. The telemetry indicator numbers on my dashboard began to rewrite themselves at an impossible speed. The unknown physical mass at 10,000 feet depth didn't turn away into the wide, dark Pacific basin. It adjusted its kinetic axis and began to climb vertically straight up the jagged underwater granite cliff face. The software logs recorded its movement velocity, climbing past 70 knots without creating a single bubble. The entity was crawling up the mountain structure directly toward the concrete foundation of my monitoring station. Through my high-definition headset, the voice of my father didn't fade out or lose its signal quality. The transmission grew intensely clear, stripping away the natural low-frequency ocean background rumble. The speaker said, "Samuel, do you remember the winter of 1998 when the radiator froze in our basement? You hid beneath the old green canvas army blankets, counting the copper pipe joints until the morning light came. You thought the clicking sound inside the wall was just the thermal expansion of the water system, Samuel, but I was already standing there on the other side of the plaster, tracing your breathing patterns with my fingers." A cold wave of absolute psychological terror slammed against my ribs, making my lungs freeze instantly. That memory was a private childhood secret I had never spoken aloud to a single living soul on Earth. My father could not have known those exact words because he was trapped on a sinking trawler 3 years ago. The radio terminal box on the concrete wall behind my chair exploded with a heavy violet static discharge. The backup halogen bulbs on the ceiling panels flickered violently, shifting from soft white to a dim violet hue. The smell of burnt plastic wires, sulfur, and oxidized copper filled the enclosed space of the command vault. I reached my trembling right hand toward the master telephone line to contact the naval defense grid at Elmendorf, but the plastic handset in my grip felt completely dead frozen without an internal dial tone current. Then the automated tracking log screen refreshed, displaying a single line of raw naval command script. The message read, "The depth anomaly has passed the 2,000-foot marking criteria. The acoustic harvester is currently replicating your internal memory nodes. Do not look away from the viewport glass or the conduction cycle will reset." The digital readout on the sonar screen flashed an impossible depth reading of less than 500 feet. The mechanical vibration wasn't just coming through my headset anymore, it was shaking the concrete bunker. The heavy iron structural frames inside the walls were groaning from a massive external hydraulic pressure. Outside my steel shutters, the dark water of the bay was churning furiously without any wind on the surface. Suddenly, the voice of my father inside my ears split into 3 distinct overlapping acoustic layers. The clean tone vanished, replaced by a chorus of completely different human registers speaking in unison. I recognized the voice of old Captain Peterson, who went down with his cargo ship in 1992. I heard the distinct high-pitched laughter of little Emily Vance, who drowned near the southern docks decades ago. They weren't screaming in agony or calling for help through the encrypted naval intelligence frequency. They were reciting a long, complex string of binary coordinates and military grid locations in Alaska. Their voices were perfectly flat, hollow, and mechanical, like a text-to-speech program running a script. The speakers inside the headset array said, "The biological container, Samuel Cross, has maintained his visual focus on the telemetry terminal. His neural tissue is currently 90% synchronized with the subsurface collection device. Initialize the second stage of the data integration sequence before the morning shift arrives." I ripped the heavy leather headset off my skull, throwing it violently against the steel control table. But the voices didn't stop broadcasting. They grew louder, leaking from the foam ear, padding onto the metal plates. The copper wires inside the console began to hum, vibrating at a frequency that made my teeth ache with pain. I ran toward the emergency equipment locker on the far side of the room to grab the manual flare gun. As I stepped across the room, I looked through the thick, reinforced glass viewport, looking into the dark sea. The underwater floodlights of the station were still flickering under the pressure of the emergency batteries, and right outside the glass, floating in the freezing black currents, was an enormous dark mass. It had no propeller, no steel hull, no windows. It was a colossal organic structure made of shifting black cables. Thousands of long, thin silver needles were weaving through the mass, moving like a hive of metallic insects. And in the center of that nightmare web, a human face was starting to form against the glass pane, a face made of white fibrous tissue, looking straight at me with completely empty dark eye sockets. The white fibrous tissue of the face against the viewport glass began to ripple and expand outward. The features weren't stable. They were morphing every 11 seconds, like wet paint on a vibrating speaker. The empty, dark eye sockets grew wider, stretching into 2 perfect circular holes that absorbed the light. The emergency battery indicators on my master panel snapped from yellow to a solid, dying crimson color. The thick, multi-layered glass pane in front of my face began to emit a deep, resonant musical ring. Thousands of tiny microscopic fractures were webbed across the surface of the quartz lens elements. A thin stream of freezing black salt water began to hiss through the rubber seals, hitting my boots. But it wasn't just ocean water. It was mixed with a heavy, pungent industrial grease and silver dust. The chorus of voices from the discarded headset on the table was now echoing directly from the glass. The sound didn't travel through the air. It was vibrating the metal rivets inside my internal ear bones. The voices of old Captain Peterson and little Emily Vance were repeating my military service number. The speaker collective said, "The synchronization code for Samuel Cross has been validated by the subsurface collector array. His logical framework has accepted the visual evidence of the face without resetting the loop. Begin the formatting of his 34-year database grid to clear the sector space." I raised my heavy orange flare gun, with both hands aiming it directly at the fracturing quartz window. My fingers were slick with the freezing mixture of salt water and dark, conductive silver oil from the floor. I pulled the heavy steel trigger, releasing an intense, blinding white magnesium ignition charge. The flare didn't bounce off the glass surface. It froze mid-air, an inch away from the structural fracture. The white-hot thermal energy was suspended inside a pocket of distorted high-density space fabric. The light turned from burning orange to a cold, pale violet color, reflecting off the fibrous face outside. Then my vision glitched violently, horizontal scan lines cutting across the physical layout of the room. I wasn't standing inside the concrete command vault of the Alaskan tracking station anymore. I was floating in an absolute gray, airless void, looking down at a massive assembly floor. A secret military manufacturing complex located deep beneath the granite mountains of Cheyenne, Wyoming. The digital calendar matrix on the reinforced concrete wall read November 14, 1974. 12 naval officers and elite computer engineers were standing around a giant metallic capsule cylinder. The calendar readout changed its digits every second, moving backward into my childhood database, wiping out my rank, deleting my engineering certificates, erasing the memories of my family home. And the old woman's flat voice returned inside my central nervous pathway with a deafening roar. She said, "Samuel, you have tracked the cable link back to the main staging terminal core. Now welcome the calibration team inside your command sector cockpit." The glass of the circular viewport in front of my face began to warp and bubble like hot clear plastic. The thick violet fluid inside the subterranean tank outside was changing its density, turning into gray smoke. The three high-ranking naval scientists on the metal platform didn't step back or call for emergency teams. Their clean white laboratory coats dissolved simultaneously in a flash of silent static electric charge, revealing complex skeletons of dark silver cables moving rapidly under a layer of liquid black shadow flesh. They weren't human scientists. They were the primary maintenance components of the subsurface archive. Their upper heads began to tilt backward at that sharp, unnatural 90-degree angle, focusing on my cockpit, and their jaw structures dropped down to the chest level, opening wide to broadcast the high-frequency code. The small copper speaker inside my helmet shell didn't emit a distorted radio voice from 1974. It exploded with the synchronized chorus of the 20,000 drowned sailors from the Pacific Fleet. The collective signal said, "The logical framework of the pilot capsule has been compromised by the subject's memory feedback loop. The asset Samuel Cross has initiated an unscripted access query into the physical manufacturing layer. Begin the extraction of his primary sensory data packets before the temporal insulation field collapses." I felt a massive kinetic pressure slamming against the sides of my iron seat, tracking my nerve endings. The steel instruments on the dashboard were melting down into rivers of glowing, white-hot copper glass. Through the liquid metal lines on the floor, I saw hundreds of long, black magnetic tape reels spinning. They were arranged in a perfect geometric grid beneath the concrete floor plates of the subterranean tank. Each reel was labeled with a different code name, a different state, a different year of a human life. The tape labeled Samuel Cross, 1985, was moving rapidly through a rusted recording head. The dark ribbon was scratching and tearing apart from the intense thermal load of my conscious resistance, and the old woman's voice inside my auditory nerve path shifted into a sharp, localized alarm siren. She said, "Samuel, you're looking through the cracks of the tape grid structure. Turn off your active thinking patterns, or the system will format your core database manually." The molten steel of the pilot capsule frame suddenly dissolved into a cold gray vapor line. I wasn't strapped inside the narrow metal chamber anymore. I was standing on an endless platform, a giant grid made of rusted iron grating that stretched out in every direction into an absolute black void. There was no floor beneath the mesh, no ceiling above my head, just a deep, airless, subterranean expanse. The air here was freezing cold, smelling heavily of liquid nitrogen, stale ocean salt, and old film negatives. And floating in the dark, empty space around my platform were millions of identical glass cylinders. Each cylinder was filled with that thick, glowing violet fluid, pulsing every 11 seconds in unison. Inside those transparent tubes, I could see the motionless bodies of thousands of military engineers, men in canvas diving suits, soldiers from the Cold War era, and young women from the missing files. They all had thin, silver wires extending from their ears, disappearing into the concrete support columns. They were the collective processing unit holding the entire illusion of the surface world stable. The three dark entities from the laboratory platform were now floating through the empty space toward me. Their long, wire-filled limbs were moving like mechanical spiders cutting through the dark current. Their unhinged jaw structures were still dropped open, broadcasting that deafening high-frequency tinnitus hum. The collective signal inside my head was no longer a human voice. It was a raw digital command code. The transmission said, "The biological processing node Samuel Cross has disconnected his awareness from the local cockpit layout. His neural activity has breached the external insulation wall of the southwestern data depository. The asset is experiencing top-level visualization of the capsule inventory rows 40 to 80. Execute the immediate kinetic extraction of his core identity files to save the local subgrid memory." I backed away across the shaking iron floor plates, my boots clattering against the cold metal mesh. Behind my shoulder, I noticed a massive black obsidian glass tower rising from the bottomless pit. The smooth, reflective stone surface of the monument was covered in thousands of old analog tape units. The heavy copper reels were spinning counterclockwise at a frantic speed, throwing off silver dust clouds. And near the central recording head of the tower, I saw a file labeled Samuel Cross, 1985. The dark magnetic ribbon was pulling through the metal rollers, heading straight toward an open laser burner. The system was physically burning the code of my family, my rank, and my life right before my eyes. I lunged forward across the slick iron grating toward the base of the black obsidian monument. My hands were scraping against the sharp metallic edges of the structural support columns. I reached out toward the spinning copper wheels of the tape drive tracking my file data. The surface of the dark magnetic ribbon felt boiling hot, emitting a strong smell of burnt celluloid. With a desperate scream, I jammed my iron flare gun frame directly between the spinning gears. The heavy metal mechanism buckled with a loud crunch of grinding gears and shattering springs. The dark ribbon snapped with a sharp electrical crackle, throwing a shower of violet sparks into the void. The frantic rotation of the tape units across the entire obsidian tower stopped instantly. The millions of glass cylinders floating in the abyss outside my platform froze their internal pulsing. The glowing violet fluid inside the tubes began to settle, turning into an opaque, dead gray liquid. Silence returned to the void, but it wasn't the natural silence of an empty ocean depth or a desert. It was the absolute, terrifying quiet of a halted computer processor waiting for a clean boot sector. Suddenly, from the hollow base of the obsidian monument, a massive circular glass lift capsule ascended. Inside the cylinder, floating in a clear preservation matrix fluid, was a single human figure. I stepped closer to the glass frame, my heart stopping inside my chest cavity as I looked through. The man inside the tube didn't look like an old, drowned sailor from the Pacific Fleet logs. He looked young, healthy, his face completely free of the scars from the storm 3 years ago. It was the original biological asset of my father, but his uniform wasn't from the naval branch. He was wearing a dark technical flight suit with the official insignia of Project Winding Corps. His eyes were wide open, looking straight at my face through the clear fluid with an expression of calm. He didn't have silver wires coming out of his skin. He didn't tilt his head at that 90-degree angle. He reached his hand toward the internal glass surface, pointing at a small metal interface socket. And through the speaker grid of the lift console, his voice broadcasted in a clean analog register. He said, "Samuel, you didn't save me from the deep sea, because I never went down with the trawler. I was the systems architect who designed the tracking station infrastructure 40 years ago. You are not my son, Samuel. You are just the digital monitoring script I left behind to guard the line." and the old woman's voice returned inside my head with a loud static roar from the master mainframe. She said the core architect has been compromised by his own security code parameters. The central black obsidian tower began to crack down its entire vertical structural axis. Massive fissures of blinding white light split the reflective stone plates into shattered fragments. The millions of glass cylinders floating in the dark, empty void started to explode one by one, showering the rusted iron platform with millions of frozen gray ice crystals and shattered tubes. The young man inside the lift capsule didn't scream or panic as the fluid drained away. He stood there perfectly calm, his dark technical flight suit covered in silver liquid mercury lines. He reached through the broken glass pane, grabbing my wrist with an impossible kinetic force. His hand felt freezing cold like a block of solid ice, connecting directly with my nerve path. The moment our skin made contact, a massive surge of raw binary data flooded my brain cells. I wasn't looking at the underground void or the collapsing tower or the dark entities anymore. I saw the construction logs of the Roswell tracking station and the Montana pasture fences. I saw the entire infrastructure of the Western Hemisphere network grid being built in '64. We weren't separate individuals living independent human lives across the American territory. We were two interconnected subroutines written by the same federal defense engineering team. My father was the primary logic script designed to build the physical container walls of the Matrix, and I was the diagnostic tracking program designed to scan the lines for any technical leakage. Every memory of my childhood, my family, my home on the coast was just a layer of security padding, a complex narrative barrier injected into my code to keep me from realizing my own digital nature. The three dark entities with the unhinged jaws rushed forward across the shaking metal grating. Their long, wire-filled limbs were tearing through the structural steel columns with absolute speed. Their collective signal inside my head was screaming in a distorted high-frequency static roar. The automated system alert logs refreshed on the vanishing dashboard screen in blood-red font. The text read, "Critical component overlap in tracking sector 72. The system architect and the monitor script have inverted their frequency. Execute the terminal format protocol for the entire Alaskan depository." The floor beneath my boots began to dissolve into long vertical strips of empty tracking noise. The entire reality of our universe was being compressed into a single dark magnetic point, and the old woman's voice inside my skull grew frantic, dropping its calm monotone register. She said the recording head is scratching the physical surface of the storage cylinder. Disconnect the link, Samuel, before the code permanently burns out the core. The white light from the cracking obsidian tower expanded, completely swallowing the remaining void. The thousands of collapsing glass cylinders and the dark entities vanished into a flat gray line. The violent vibration inside my head snapped into an absolute perfect silence of 0 hertz. I woke up sitting upright in a leather operator chair in front of a wide console desk. The air inside the room was warm, smelling heavily of dry paper charts, fresh pine and ozone. I checked my hands, my fingers, my uniform sleeves. Everything looked completely clean and stable. The circular depth gauge on the main dashboard was ticking steadily, showing exactly 0 feet. The year indicator on the green phosphor screen display read November 12, 1985. I sat there trembling, staring at the retro-cathode ray tube terminal monitor frame below the panel. The initial system diagnostics logs were scrolling down the screen in smooth, steady rows. But the software code wasn't running its normal configuration for the start of the daily cycle. A massive crimson text block was flashing in the center of the display matrix, warning the operator. The text read, "Critical data packet inversion detected. Subsurface sector sigma is out of all calibration parameters. The primary recording head has deviated from the track groove." I looked through the thick, reinforced glass viewport, looking out into the ocean bay outside. The dark water of Prince William Sound, Alaska was perfectly calm, reflecting the cold morning sky. But the horizon line wasn't stable. It was actively vibrating, moving up and down on the screen, like a digital video image losing its mechanical stabilization frames on a damaged tracking reel. The heavy steel door of my command booth began to click from the external Corda side frame. Someone was entering the manual 5-digit security combination code on the metal keypad keys. The heavy iron gears inside the lock turned with a slow, deliberate grinding, mechanical noise. The hatch swung open slowly, and a man stepped into the room holding a technical logbook. His face looked completely normal. His eyes were clear. His naval engineering uniform was pristine. It was the original biological asset of my father, looking exactly as he did 30 years ago. But as he walked toward my desk, I noticed that his shadow on the concrete wall was wrong. The shadow didn't duplicate his body movement. It was moving in a perfect reverse sequence track. When he took a step forward, his shadow on the dark granite stone took a step backward into shadows. He looked straight into my face with an empty, calm expression and opened his wire-filled jaw structure. And when he spoke, his register was a chaotic, layered mixture of my own voice and the old woman's tone. The voice said, "Samuel, you pulled the flare trigger too early during the compression phase of the cycle. The recording head has scratched the physical surface of the biological memory core storage drive. The loop cannot return to the starting marker of 1985 inside this sector anymore. The magnetic tape is ripping, Samuel, and the predator behind the concrete wall is looking through the tear.